"Don't shake his hand," he muttered, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "He's not one of us." That was my daughter's father-in-law, Carl Whitaker, chairman of a multi-million-dollar logistics company and walking embodiment of a smug country club elitist. I had just extended my hand at their shareholder meeting, trying to be civil, maybe even finally accepted after months of cold stares. But instead, he looked at my hand like I'd just wiped it on a urinal and tried to offer him a handshake. That moment burned itself into my memory, not because of Carl's condescending tone, not even because of the smug little chuckle that went around the table. No, it was my daughter's silence. She looked away, said nothing, like she agreed. "Hey, before we go any further, if you like stories with deep payoffs, real justice, and clever revenge, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next." Now, let me rewind. Just a few months earlier, I was nothing more than a proud father, standing on the lawn of a ridiculously expensive vineyard, watching my only daughter marry into what I thought was a good family. The Whitakers. Old money. Sharp suits. Real smiles that never quite reached their eyes. My daughter, Emily, had always been brilliant. Straight-A student, self-driven, classy. But I didn't raise her with silver spoons or legacy admissions. I was a high school teacher for 30 years. Taught civics, government, ethics. Never made much money, but I made a name for myself being decent. Honest. The kind of guy who still held the door open and paid his taxes down to the penny. So when she brought home Blake Whitaker, I'll admit, I was skeptical. The guy was polite, but stiff. Kept glancing at his phone while I was talking. Didn't ask me a single question about my life. He was more interested in telling me how his dad had built a logistics empire and doesn't tolerate dead weight. Real inspirational stuff. But Emily looked happy. In love, even. So I bit my tongue. Smiled through the engagement dinners. Nodded during speeches I didn't believe in. I even wore a rented tux I could barely afford for the damn wedding. That's when I got the first taste of what they really thought of me. At the rehearsal dinner, I tried to make small talk with Carl, the future father-in-law. I asked him about the company, just being friendly. He took one sip of his overpriced wine and said, "Let's not pretend you'd understand our kind of business." I laughed it off, thinking maybe he had a weird sense of humor. But then, Emily pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. "Dad, I love you, but please, don't get involved in their business. It's not your world." That hit harder than I expected. Not because she was wrong, I wasn't part of their world, but because it sounded like she didn't want me to be. Like I was some charity case she was trying to keep in the back room during dinner service. I told her I wasn't trying to get involved, just trying to connect. She said she understood, but the damage was already done. After the wedding, things didn't get better. I'd get invited to a few family events here and there, but I could always feel the invisible wall between me and them. The way Carl would pat me on the back and instantly wipe his hand on his pants. The way Blake would roll his eyes when I brought up anything remotely blue-collar. Even Emily started acting more curated, polished, like she was practicing to be someone else's daughter. Then came the charity gala. This was one of those events where they auction off art none of them like, just to brag about donations. I wasn't even supposed to be there, but Emily insisted I come so we could spend more time together. The moment I walked in, I saw Carl whispering to someone and nodding toward me with that same smirk. I found my way to the bar and ended up sitting next to one of Carl's business partners. Nice guy, surprisingly. We got to talking, and after a couple of drinks, he let something slip. Yeah, Carl's been running this brilliant logistics trick, funneling contracts through shell companies to cut taxes and inflate the books. Everyone wins. Well, everyone at the top. I froze. I taught business ethics for over a decade. What he just described wasn't clever, it was fraud. At best, it was a grotesque loophole that danced on the edge of legality. At worst, it was a full-on criminal scheme hiding behind fake paperwork and cronies. I didn't say anything then. I just nodded, sipped my drink, and kept smiling like a good little outsider. But that night, something changed. I went home, sat in my quiet kitchen, and stared at a photo of Emily on her graduation day. Me in my old corduroy blazer, her in cap and gown, beaming like the sun. I remembered what I used to tell my students. If you see something wrong and stay quiet, you're part of the problem. I realized then, I didn't care if I wasn't part of their world. I didn't want to be part of that world, but I would be the thorn in its side. I would be the one voice they couldn't shut out, the hand they refused to shake, but couldn't ignore. They thought I was just some washed-up teacher with no power? They were about to learn that the truth, when weaponized correctly, is more dangerous than money. And the first move I made was buying into their game. I didn't sleep much after that gala. Something about the way that business partner said it, like it was a joke they'd all been laughing at for years, kept repeating in my head. Shell companies. Inflated contracts. Everyone at the top wins. You don't have to teach ethics for 3 decades to know when you've heard a confession. So I started digging. Quietly. I didn't want to believe my daughter had married into a criminal operation. I wanted to believe Carl was just an arrogant blowhard. But the deeper I looked, the more things didn't add up. First, I went through all the public filings for Whitaker Logistics. I knew how to read these things. Every company has some smoke and mirrors, tax maneuvering, complex ownership structures. But Whitaker's reports were practically Swiss cheese. Payments going to consultants with no background. Warehousing contracts duplicated across different entities. Subsidiaries opened and closed within months, all conveniently just under the threshold for reporting oversight. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people don't want to notice. But I noticed. Still, I didn't say anything. Not yet. I kept showing up to family events, kept smiling politely, even when Carl ignored me and Blake acted like I was his Uber driver. I was invisible. And honestly, that helped. People talk more freely around someone they've decided doesn't matter. That's how I started learning the family dynamics. Blake wasn't a CEO yet, but he was being groomed for it. Carl treated him like the golden child, even though it was obvious to anyone with ears that Blake had the leadership instincts of a drunk pigeon. Everything was about image and maintaining legacy. Carl would say things like, "Our name is the brand. You lose the name, you lose everything." I remember thinking, you lose your integrity, and you've already lost everything. But what really set my alarm bells off was a conversation I overheard during a birthday dinner for Carl's wife. We were at some overpriced rooftop restaurant in Manhattan, and while everyone else was 2 martinis in, I was nursing my water and pretending to scroll through emails. Blake leaned into a cousin and said, "Dad's worried about the audit. If those third-party contracts don't clear, he wants to burn the old warehouse records." The cousin just nodded and said, "Yeah, cleaner that way." They laughed. I sat there, stunned. They weren't even hiding it anymore. It was around that time that Emily started pulling away more. She was always busy, always in meetings. She didn't return calls for days. When I finally got her to meet me for coffee, she showed up looking different, colder, sharper, like a woman trying very hard to be made of steel. I told her I missed her, that I was worried about what I was hearing around her husband's family. She sipped her drink and said, "Dad, you're overthinking everything. Carl's just old school. They know how to handle themselves." "You mean they know how to bury things?" I said. She frowned. "You don't know what you're talking about." She stood up to leave, paused, and gave me a look that broke my heart a little. "You were a great teacher, a great dad, but this world? It's above your pay grade." And just like that, she was gone. She didn't say it to be cruel. I think, in her own warped way, she was trying to protect me. But what she didn't understand was, I didn't need protection. I needed the truth. And I was getting dangerously close to it. That night, I sat down with a legal pad and wrote out everything I had. Names, dates, shell companies, paper trails. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it. But I knew this. If they were so desperate to keep people like me out of their world, it meant I was exactly where I needed to be. Next step? I was going to stop standing on the sidelines. I was going to buy my way in. Buying in wasn't as easy as I thought. These people had built layers of insulation around their business like it was Fort Knox. The main company, Whitaker Logistics Incorporated, was public, but just barely. It traded under a different name, buried beneath holding companies, designed so outsiders wouldn't know what they were looking at unless they really wanted to know. Luckily for me, I really wanted to know. I spent weeks combing through filings, cross-referencing board members, finding the exact ticker symbol hidden behind 3 levels of shell companies. It took longer than it should have, but I finally did it. One morning, with my 3rd cup of black coffee in hand, I clicked buy on 1,000 shares. Just enough to show up on the record as a minor stakeholder. I wasn't some billionaire activist investor. I was a high school teacher who had stashed his savings in a retirement fund. But now, I had a legal right to attend shareholder meetings, ask questions, and demand answers. I was in. And the second that purchase cleared, I noticed something strange. Silence. See, I thought someone would notice. Maybe Blake would call. Maybe Carl would send one of his lawyers to politely ask what I was doing. But no, nothing. Not a single peep. That's when I realized they didn't see me as a threat, not even worth investigating. To them, I was just some clueless old man who bought stock by accident. Perfect. The next shareholder meeting was coming up in 2 months. That gave me time. Time to dig deeper, time to get smart. I knew from experience. If you walk into a lion's den unprepared, you don't get a second chance. I started compiling files. Every document I could find, I printed and cross-checked. I built spreadsheets. I started reaching out to people, quietly, who were also listed as small shareholders. Most of them didn't care. Some had inherited the stock and didn't even know what they owned. But one guy did care. His name was Alan Chow. He was a former employee who had taken his severance package in shares, back when Carl still pretended to respect the workforce. Alan had been pushed out for asking too many questions about, get this, missing shipments and inflated shipping costs. Sound familiar? We met up at a coffee shop in Queens. He was skeptical of me at first, thought I was trying to buy his shares or squeeze him for info. But when I showed him my files, his eyes lit up. "You're serious about this?" he asked. "Dead serious." Alan didn't just confirm my suspicions, he gave me new ones. He told me how Carl had slowly replaced old leadership with loyalists, how the accounting department had one guy who didn't even have a degree, how vendors were handpicked through handshake deals, not bids. And the best part? Alan still had his ID from his last week on the job, complete with a QR code that got us access to the employee portal. That night, we logged in. It wasn't a gold mine, but it was enough. Enough to prove that certain contracts were being recycled, rebranded, and routed through what looked like ghost vendors. And guess who approved those payments? Blake Whitaker, my son-in-law. The guy who couldn't program his own GPS was authorizing six-figure payments to LLCs registered in Delaware with no phone number. My hands were shaking when I saw it. My daughter had married into rot, but I didn't call her. Not yet. I didn't yell or demand she come clean. This had to be methodical, strategic. One shot, well placed. The shareholder meeting was now 6 weeks away. I'd be there, sitting right across from Carl. With a question in hand he wouldn't see coming. I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't get angry. I'd do what I always did best. Ask the one question no one could ignore. 6 weeks out from the shareholder meeting, and my kitchen looked like the lair of a conspiracy theorist. Documents covered the table, sticky notes on the fridge, printouts taped to the walls like I was solving a murder. In a way, I was. The murder of accountability. The slow, arrogant suffocation of truth. Alan and I met 3 times a week, usually late at night. We went over everything: logistics contracts, shell company registries, employee rosters, emails, invoices, even blurry photos of shipment records he had taken before he was fired. What we found was more than just shady. It was a system. There were at least 7 different LLCs, each with vague names like Mariner Supply Company or East Ridge Logistics, all registered to P.O. boxes, with no websites, no employees, no history. Just a legal name and a routing number. And Whitaker Logistics was sending them hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each invoice was just under $100,000. Why? Because anything above that triggered mandatory reporting. Smart. Illegal, but smart. I also found out something else. Carl wasn't just protecting his son, he was cleaning up his own tracks. One of the shell companies was linked to a Cayman Islands account in the name of Margaret Whitaker, Carl's wife. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just some rogue executive laundering money behind the board's back. This was generational crime. They were building a dynasty out of fraud. And I was going to bring it down with a question. But not just any question. I needed to hit hard, with something undeniable. Something surgical. That's when I remembered the logistics report from 3 quarters ago. There had been a supply chain delay blamed on international port issues. But I cross-referenced it with actual shipping data from the port of New Jersey. And surprise, no such delay had ever been recorded. In fact, Whitaker's shipping numbers had been higher than average that month. So where had the inventory gone? Answer: nowhere. It didn't exist. They billed phantom shipments to shell companies. Fake services for real money. That was my weapon. While Alan dug into more records, I reached out to someone I never thought I'd speak to again, Daniel Ortiz, one of my former students. He was now an attorney specializing in corporate whistleblowing. The kid had gone from a bored sophomore to a courtroom animal. I gave him everything. Didn't ask him to act, just asked if I was on solid ground. He called me the next day. "Mr. Adams, this is gold. You're sitting on a racketeering case. If you go public, I'll back you." That was the first time I felt like I wasn't just an old man on a personal crusade. I was part of something bigger, something righteous. But I still had one problem: my daughter. Emily still hadn't called, still hadn't asked why I was suddenly distant. Either she was in denial, or she knew exactly what her husband and his father were doing, and was choosing silence. I hated thinking that, but I couldn't afford to guess anymore. Not when I was this deep. So I wrote her a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real, handwritten letter. I told her I loved her, that I didn't expect her to pick sides, but that I would be at the next shareholder meeting, and that when I asked my question, the entire room would hear the answer. I sealed it, mailed it. No return address. A week before the meeting, I received a typed note in a blank envelope. No signature. "Stay in your lane. This isn't your war." No return address. No doubt where it came from. They were scared. And that meant I was exactly where I needed to be. With the shareholder meeting just 2 weeks away, my focus shifted from gathering evidence to preparing for battle. This wasn't going to be a courtroom or a protest. It was a boardroom, a space built on subtlety, strategy, and pressure. You don't shout in these rooms. You ask questions that cause silence. I wanted that silence. But I knew it couldn't just be me. One voice in a crowd can be dismissed. But a chorus? That gets attention. So I started reaching out again, to the small, overlooked investors. Retirees, former employees, even one guy who only owned shares because his late uncle willed them to him. I didn't pitch some grand justice campaign. I just told them what I'd found and asked one question. "Don't you want to know where your money is really going?" Some said no. Some ghosted me. But a few said yes. And one of them was loud. Her name was Marie Donnelly, 73 years old, former warehouse manager. She had been fired when she questioned a mislabeled shipment 10 years ago. They called it restructuring, she told me over the phone. But it was revenge. Marie still held a small block of stock, and more importantly, she had stories. Stories about inventory that came in but never went out. About workers who disappeared after asking too many questions. About Carl standing in the center of the floor, barking orders like a mob boss in a suit. She was in, and she had nothing to lose. Together, we started building a coalition. 7 of us, in total. Small voices, spread across the map. But together, we represented just enough ownership to be heard. I also worked on my delivery. I practiced the exact wording of my question, over and over. I wanted it calm. Precise. Impossible to dodge. I rehearsed with Alan, with Marie, even in front of a mirror. And then, the unexpected happened. I got a call from Emily. I stared at the screen for a full 10 seconds before I answered. "Dad," she said, her voice quiet. "I got your letter." There was a pause. And then, "Are you sure about everything?" It wasn't a denial. It wasn't anger. It was fear. I told her the truth. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to let her know that this wasn't paranoia. This was fraud. Documented. Proven. She didn't say much. Just that she needed time. And then she hung up. I stared at the wall for a long time after that. I didn't know what side she would land on. I didn't even know if she wanted to believe me. But I knew I'd cracked something. A wall between us. Maybe just a crack, but enough light had gotten through. Then the final prep began. We each filed notice with the board that we would be attending and intended to speak. It was a procedural thing, but it meant they had to give us space. That space would be limited, 1 question per shareholder. That's all I needed. The night before the meeting, I didn't sleep. Not out of fear, out of purpose. I wasn't just some guy anymore. I was about to walk into their polished, high-rise boardroom and blow a hole straight through their paper empire. I ironed my only decent blazer, wrote my question out by hand, and packed every document, invoice, and spreadsheet I'd gathered into a clean leather folder. Let them ignore me. Let them smirk. They didn't know it yet, but they'd already lost. The building was designed to intimidate. 40 stories of steel, glass, and ego, the Whitaker Logistics corporate headquarters. Every square inch screamed power, from the gold-leafed company logo rotating in the lobby to the marble floors that echoed your every step. It was clear, this place wasn't built for people like me. But I wasn't here to admire the architecture. I was here to ask one question. The security guard didn't even glance at me when I handed him my shareholder badge. Why would he? I was a blip. A blip in a suit from a department store and shoes older than most interns. But I walked tall. I took the elevator to the 39th floor and entered the conference room where the annual shareholder meeting was already in motion. A sea of suits, ties, glossy binders, and fake smiles. At the head of the room, Carl Whitaker, calm, commanding, exactly the kind of man who thinks the law bends for him. I found a seat along the back wall next to Marie and gave her a nod. Alan wasn't allowed in, non-shareholder, but he was watching the live stream from a cafe down the street. We had a system. If anything went wrong, he'd know instantly. The opening formalities dragged on. Profits up, shipping expansion, blah blah. Carl spoke about strategic growth and shareholder value. No mention of ethics. No mention of accountability. Just numbers and buzzwords. Then they opened the floor. A moderator stood up and said the magic words. We now open the floor to questions from registered shareholders. Marie went first. Her voice trembled a bit, but she held firm. Mr. Whitaker, can you speak to the number of vendor contracts processed without competitive bids over the last fiscal year? Carl smiled. Smooth. Thank you for your question, Ms. Donnelly. Our procurement process adheres strictly to industry standards. Lies. But no one blinked. 2 more questions followed, softballs. Polite concerns about dividend schedules and stock buybacks. Then they called my name. I stood slowly. I felt every eye shift toward me. Carl's lips tightened. He recognized me. And in that moment, I saw it. The flicker of fear. Good. I took a breath and delivered my question, calm and clear. Can the board explain the purpose of 3 consecutive logistics contracts, all approved within 48 hours, routed through Mariner Supply Company, East Ridge Logistics, and Polaris Freight Solutions, all of which list no physical address, no employees, and no operational record, despite collectively receiving over $280,000 in payments during a shipping quarter with no confirmed outbound inventory? The room fell dead silent. Carl's face froze. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them actually dropped his pen. I waited. The moderator blinked. Would you like that question directed to a specific board member? No, I said. Anyone who approved the payments will do. More silence. Then Carl spoke. Slowly. I'm not familiar with the details of those specific vendors, but I assure you. I cut him off. Would it help if I showed the payment invoices? Gasps. Marie smiled wide. Carl's jaw tensed. This is highly irregular. So are the contracts. He started to speak again, but the moderator stepped in. Thank you, Mr. Adams. The board will review your documentation after the meeting. I sat down. I had thrown the stone. Now I just had to watch the ripples. Carl didn't speak again for the rest of the meeting. His face was pale. His hands, no longer steady. As the meeting ended and people filtered out, one of the junior board members dropped a business card on my folder and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't smile, but his eyes said enough. The truth had been spoken, and it was louder than Carl Whitaker's entire empire. The fallout started faster than I expected. Within 48 hours of the meeting, 2 of the 7 board members publicly requested an internal audit. By the end of the week, a third had stepped down for personal reasons. But anyone paying attention knew exactly why. Carl Whitaker was still technically in power, but the smell of blood was in the water. The press hadn't picked up the story yet, but internal memos had started to leak. Someone had forwarded copies of the vendor contracts I referenced to a financial watchdog blog. By Monday morning, a headline hit the web. Anonymous shareholder exposes suspicious payments at Whitaker Logistics. It didn't name me, but it didn't have to. I got 3 emails from other shareholders. 2 just said thank you. One was from a hedge fund rep asking for more information. I ignored that one. I wasn't doing this for profit. This wasn't about flipping stock. This was about exposing rot. Marie called me that night, almost breathless. They just canceled next quarter's bonus review. Said the numbers were being reevaluated. That was huge. It meant they were panicking. 2 days later, I got a call I didn't expect from the board secretary. Mr. Adams, the board has taken note of your concerns and would like to invite you to serve as a temporary ethics liaison during the internal review. I paused. Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to burn the whole thing to the ground and walk away. But then I thought about the workers like Marie, the shareholders who'd been lied to, the people who were still inside that system and didn't even realize how deep the rot went. I said yes. They sent over documents for me to sign. I reviewed them with Daniel Ortiz, My former student turned lawyer. He said they were clean, transparent. Smart move by the board. They were trying to distance themselves from Carl without going fully nuclear. Smart, but not fast enough. Because by then, the audit was already underway. And it was ugly. Payments to shell companies. Fake shipping logs. A consulting firm that was actually run by Carl's college roommate's son, registered out of a garage in Nevada. They even found records of personal purchases, golf memberships, watches, luxury retreats, billed as business development expenses. I didn't have to expose them anymore. They were exposing themselves. But there was still one silence I couldn't shake. Emily hadn't called. Not since that quiet phone call 2 weeks ago. I hadn't pushed. I wanted her to come to terms with things in her own time. But it weighed on me. Because even though I'd won something big, it felt like I might have lost her. Then, one evening, I got a text. Just 3 words. I believe you. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't reply right away. I didn't know what to say, but I knew what it meant. She'd seen something, or heard something, and it finally broke through the wall Carl had built around her. Maybe it was my question. Maybe it was Blake's behavior. Maybe it was something darker. But it didn't matter. The crack was now a fracture. And Carl's empire? It wasn't just bleeding. It was crumbling. 3 weeks after the shareholder meeting, Carl Whitaker was suspended by the board. Officially, it was pending the results of an internal investigation. Unofficially, they were done covering for him. The audit findings were too damning. Payments with no paper trails, ghost vendors linked to family members, and internal emails that reeked of cover-ups. It wasn't just financial fraud anymore. It was conspiracy. Blake tried to play damage control. Poor kid. He wasn't built for it. I watched a live stream of his first solo investor call. He stumbled through half sentences, dodged questions with a nervous laugh, and actually said, "We're looking into what our team is looking into," at one point. A week later, he took an indefinite leave of absence to focus on family. Translation, he cracked. Meanwhile, my position as ethics liaison became more than symbolic. I was sitting in board meetings, reviewing vendor policies, even asked to help draft new transparency guidelines. And people were listening. The same suits who used to sneer at me were now nodding when I spoke. I was no longer the outsider. I was the guy who walked through the front door, uninvited, and exposed what they all pretended not to see. But even as the company began to right itself, I still had one thing unresolved. Emily. She hadn't texted again. No calls. No follow-up. And I wasn't going to push. I'd done my part. She had to decide what kind of life she wanted, now that the mask had come off. Then one morning, I heard a knock. I opened the door, and there she was, standing on my porch with sunglasses on and a manila folder in her hand. "Can we talk?" she asked. I nodded. We sat at the kitchen table, like we used to, back when she'd come home from school and ran about college essays and cafeteria drama. She slid the folder toward me. Inside were printouts, emails, financial statements, call logs. "I found them on Blake's home computer," she said. "He didn't even bother encrypting it." They were more than enough to confirm what I'd suspected. Blake knew. The whole time. Not just about the shell companies, but how they were being used to siphon off money, hide losses, and manipulate quarterly earnings. "I confronted him," she said. "He told me it's just how business works. That my dad was making a big deal out of nothing." She paused. Then her voice cracked. I didn't know who to believe. For a while, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't say anything. Just let her sit with it. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red. "I filed for divorce." That hit hard. Not because I didn't see it coming, but because I knew how much it hurt her to say it out loud. She reached into her purse and pulled out a smaller envelope. Inside was a notarized transfer form. "These are my shares," she said. "They're yours now." I blinked. "You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted. "You earned them, and I want a clean slate." It wasn't about stock. It wasn't about revenge. It was her way of saying, "I see you now." We sat in silence for a long while. Just 2 people, wounded by the same lie, slowly rebuilding something real. And then she smiled, small but honest. "So, what's next, Dad?" I didn't know, but I knew it would be on our terms this time. I didn't expect to see Carl again. After his suspension, he vanished from the company entirely. No statements, no emails, no farewell tour. Just gone, like a ghost in a tailored suit. But ghosts have a way of returning when you least want them to. It was a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Emily handed me the documents. I was at the downtown office, reviewing transparency policy drafts with the board. We broke for lunch, and I stepped out to grab a coffee from the corner shop. That's when I saw him, Carl Whitaker, standing on the sidewalk like he owned the city. Designer coat, expensive shoes, and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in days. He locked eyes with me, and for a second, just a second, the mask cracked. He looked scared. "You really think this is over?" he asked. I didn't answer. He stepped closer, dropping his voice. "I built that company. I carried it through 3 recessions, through strikes, lawsuits, global disruptions. And you stroll in from nowhere and think you've got the moral high ground?" "I didn't stroll in," I said. "I walked in through the front door. Something you stopped doing a long time ago." He scoffed, but I could see the desperation in his eyes. "You don't understand how the world works. People like me, we have to make hard calls. We take risks. We bend things. That's how business survives." "No," I replied. "That's how it rots." He looked like he wanted to say more, but I cut him off. "You had everything, Carl. Power, legacy, a family, and you traded it for shortcuts and lies." I expected him to snap, to yell, maybe even shove me. But instead, he just looked down. For the first time, I saw it. Not just fear, but something close to shame. "You think you're better than me?" he muttered. "No," I said quietly. "I think I remember what better looks like." And then I walked away. That night, Emily called. "I heard he showed up," she said. "Did he try to threaten you?" "He tried to justify himself." "Did it work?" I laughed. "You tell me." She paused. Then, "I'm proud of you." That meant more than anything. The next day, it became official. Carl Whitaker was permanently removed from the board. Blake's resignation followed soon after. Charges were being filed, not just civil, but criminal. The DOJ had taken interest. The company was cooperating fully. The Whitaker name was no longer a shield. It was a target. But for me, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. About showing that one man, even a quiet one, even an outsider, could still make a difference. When the company offered me a permanent role on the ethics committee, I declined. "I didn't come here to stay," I told them. "I came to fix what was broken. Now it's your job to keep it honest." They respected that. I left the boardroom for the last time with my head high. No flash. No headlines. Just quiet, clean victory. Later that week, Emily invited me to dinner. Her house, not the penthouse. She made chili from scratch, just like her mom used to. "So," she asked, "how does it feel to be the guy who took down an empire?" I smiled. It wasn't an empire. It was a house of cards. She raised her glass. "To truth. To honor," I replied. "The best stock you can own." It's strange how life resets. One moment, you're an aging dad with a quiet routine and a daughter slowly drifting away. The next, you've taken down a corrupt corporate dynasty, reconnected with your family, and found yourself back in the game. This time, on your own terms. After Carl and Blake were gone, the company restructured fast. They brought in real auditors, external oversight. 2 board members I'd worked with pushed through reforms that had been stalled for years. I didn't take credit. I didn't want it. The change mattered more than my name on a plaque. Emily finalized her divorce a month later. It wasn't easy on her. The media circled like vultures. Some tabloids ran headlines like, "Whistleblower's daughter leaves disgraced empire." She hated it, but she stayed strong. And she stayed honest. That, more than anything, made me proud. She didn't go back to the penthouse or the fancy circles. She rented a small apartment near her old college. Said she needed to find her voice again. And then, one night over dinner, she surprised me. "I want to start something," she said. "A nonprofit. Something real." She wanted to build an organization that provided corporate transparency training to young professionals and startups. Something that could teach the values I had once taught in my classroom, only now, at scale. "I'll run the front end," she said. "You'll be the ethics guy? Deal?" I nearly choked on my chili. But yeah, I said yes. We called it the Clear Ledger. It started as a blog, then a few podcasts, then a small team. Before long, we were consulting for mid-sized companies across the state. No flash, no fluff, just integrity and a little vengeance in the best way. And me? I found peace in it. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was building something with my daughter. Something clean, honest, and stronger than anything Carl Whitaker ever owned. Sometimes people ask me if I regret going that far. Blowing the whistle, starting the fight. No, not for a second. Because here's the truth. You don't have to be powerful to do what's right. You just have to refuse to stay quiet. If you've made it this far, thank you for coming on this ride with me. What do you think? Did I do the right thing? What would you have done in my place? Drop a comment below. I read every one. And if you love stories about justice, betrayal, and clever payback, hit that like button, subscribe, and don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next story.